So congratulations. My name is Orly McCall, and I'm here today because I did a piece of research for QQI, which was called a thematic analysis. And essentially the research was to look back over a period of 1.5, almost 2 years, so from 2018 to the middle of 2020, at the re-engagement process, and to see what were common themes that were emerging and if there were lessons to be learned, both for QQI and for a very high level. The summary of the analysis was, first of all, I was to review and analyse all the panel reports that had been created to the date that the research was to be completed. And I had to analyse both the published and the unpublished reports. So as I said, I looked at 32 re-engagement reports. I conducted individual interviews with panel members, chairs, report writers, and members of panels without either of those particular jobs on the panels, and I also spoke to a number of providers. I conducted individual interviews with a number of QQI staff members. We did 2 sets of questionnaires to which we had almost 100 respondents. I read a lot of the documentation, in particular the policies and guidelines that QQI have published in relation to re-engagement. I observed a QQI session which was in person, so a session like this, and I wasn't able to do any of the focus group discussions because we weren't allowed to leave the house. So that was really the methodology. It was quite comprehensive. So in terms of the outcomes, like Deirdre mentioned, one of the outcomes is that you can be approved straight through. A second outcome is that you could be refused with mandatory changes, or you could just be refused outright. And as part of the process, as Deirdre mentioned, there is an option, although not a legal outcome, there is an option that a panel can say, listen, we're going to defer our decision, and that generally happens when a panel feels that the provider is very close to getting through and it only needs a little bit of time to actually address some issues. So a panel can decide that it's going to defer its decision for generally a period of 6 weeks. Now, what the research found is that the most common outcome, so of all of those applicants, the 30 applicants at the time, the most common outcome was that a provider was refused approval pending mandatory changes. So meaning that there was a recommendation to refuse until the provider could make a number of mandatory changes. So 40% of the applicants ended up in that category. The least common outcome, and that was at 25%, is that a provider got straight through the process without having to make any mandatory changes. And the other outcome that I mentioned, which isn't a legal outcome, but it is something that can happen as part of the process, is that you can be in a situation where you have what's called a deferred decision. And almost 35% of those organizations that went through the process ended up at some point in time in that particular category. At the time that I did the research, and like I said, it ended up in, close enough to the summer this year, no provider had been outright refused. And whilst that is a potential option, at the time I did the research, that hadn't happened. So really the big picture here from my perspective, and perhaps from yours, would be that 75% of the organizations that applied had to go off and do further work after the panel had visited with them before they went on to be approved. And I'll look at that in a little bit more detail now. So as I said, 75% of providers were required to make mandatory changes prior to completing the process. So that 75% included people who ended up in the deferred decision box, and then people who went straight to being refused pending those mandatory changes. On average, each provider that I looked at was required to make 6 mandatory changes. So while some had 1 and some had close to 10 or 11, the average was around 6. And of the 32 providers that went through that process who did get that outcome of mandatory changes, there were 140 of those changes that were recommended in total, so across all the providers. And when you look at those 140 recommended changes, close enough to 50% of them actually were asking providers to make a change that related to governance. So 46.5% of those 140 mandatory changes related specifically to governance issues which needed to be addressed. And Danny, who's going to speak shortly after me here now, will really start to unpack that a little bit for you, since governance is quite a wide topic. The next biggest bunch of mandatory changes that were recommended, and that's at 20%, so it's, you know, it's a fifth of all those changes. They related to how people had put together their documentation, and really that the documentation was put together in such a way that it was not easy for the panels to make a clear link between what was in the document and the 11 criteria that are set out in the guidelines that need to be met by providers in order to get through the process and eventually be approved for re-engagement. So, you know, if you're taking any notes today about where you need to kind of really focus in, or where people have really struggled, is around governance, and then secondly, how people have put their paperwork together, and the difficulty in matching up the paperwork then to that particular set of criteria. Thanks, Marie. So one of the things I did look at, and this is, I think, is my second last slide, so bear with me, is I looked at the process, and I had interviewed many people, and I spoke to providers, and I also spoke to panel members, and when providers were talking to me about the process, they genuinely said to me, and in answering the questionnaires, that they really found the process to have been a positive experience. And this is in retrospect. I didn't speak to anybody who was starting it or in the middle of it or going into it, but these are people who had gone through it to some extent. And they genuinely said, look, Orly, this was a really good experience, and we are in a much better situation than we were when we started this, as a result of having gone through the process. So, you know, it was a very positive story coming from the providers. Now, they did, however, say, and I think this is important to note, that they found it tough. They were telling me that they found it, the word we finally agreed on was to say that it was onerous. And very, very resource intensive. So, you know, it's not a one person job. You can't just give this to one person and say, can you write up our QA manual and make sure it matches this criteria and then lash it in and we'll see how we fare. It took all of the people involved in the organization and anybody from outside of the organization but involved to actually bring it over the line. So that's worth making a note about. When I spoke to panel members, and many panel members have sat on 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 panels. what was very helpful to find out is that they felt that the process was applied consistently. So regardless of the size of the provider, the location of the provider, how many students were going through, when they were going through, the panel were very consistent in how they applied the process. And finally then, I asked all the panel members that I spoke to, do you feel that this process is fit for purpose? So is it the right process to determine if the quality assurance procedures meet these criteria? And that there was very positive response from the panel. So there's some good messages there. So I used to be what Deirdre and Walter are now. So I used to be head of quality assurance in an organisation called HETAC. So I'm going to give 10 pieces of advice, but the advice really is coming mostly from the research. So this is a kind of if I were you story. What are you going to take away from the research and the experience in the room today? The first piece of advice, and there's 9, but I'll run through them quickly. Please do familiarise yourself with the QQI documentation. I know it's not easy. I've been working in QA for 20 years, and it's not an easy thing to do, to sit down and try and go through that documentation, but it is so important that you and as many of the people you can pull into the room do that. One of the really key things that people were saying to me is to take some time to look at what's already published out there and to see what is considered both good practice and where organizations really had to do additional work. You can learn a lot from where panels have really highlighted, look, this section is looking at, say, learner assessment, and this organisation has an excellent learner assessment policy. That then I would be going on and looking at their assessment policy and see can you learn anything from that. And likewise with the not so great news. You're at this formal information session now, so that's absolutely super, but I would also encourage you to pick up the phone and talk to anybody who's already been through this, because what I was picking up during my research is that people are so delighted to help each other out and to be able to share their experience. So do not hesitate to pick up the telephone and ask one of the other providers to help you out, or anybody who you think might be helpful. Please do make sure, though, that your documentation is clear. When I was writing up to read it and make sure it's got something, no problems in it before you send it in. One of the big things that did come up in the research was that where organizations didn't take the gap analysis seriously, so where they didn't take time to really engage everybody in the gap analysis, they ended up in problems straight away. So when you're doing your self-evaluation, do take it as seriously as you can, and don't be afraid to say, look, we've got kind of shortcomings or blind spots here or there. Another issue that came up in the research was that a lot of committees that people are on, that they're so used to being on and they kind of know what the committee's about, is one thing, but writing that all down is often not clear in the documentation. So Danny will pick this up again. When it comes to governance and it comes to those governance structures and committees, do take time to be really clear on who's on it, what it's supposed to do, what it's not supposed to do, and the terms of reference. Test your documentation against the QQI criteria, and do be open during the process. I think you'll hear and know from David and from Danny, both who are very, very experienced panel members, that they are really there to get you through. Nobody's in this to try and trip anybody up. The more open you can be, the better it's going to be for you at the end of the day. And finally, for me, before I hand over to Danny Brennan, do not hesitate but to pick up the phone to Marie or to Deirdre or to Walter. As part of my